Okay, geographers, Mr. Majewski back here with your migration review questions. And that means we're starting with number 17 on the review sheet. Know the difference between emigration and immigration and how to determine net migration. Okay, emigration is when people leave a country or when a person leaves a country. So the country you leave, you are emigrating from. So it's the process of leaving a country. Immigration is the process of going to a new country. So again, if you leave England and come to the United States, you emigrated from England and you immigrated to the United States. How do you determine net migration, which is the second part of that question? Remember, it's really simple. You take the number of emigrants, which are the number of people that are leaving your country, and then you compare it to the number of immigrants, the number of people coming in. If the number of people leaving, immigrants, is larger, then you are a net out country because you have more folks that are leaving than are coming in. If the number of immigrants is larger than the emigrant number, then you are net in, which means you are attracting more people than you are losing. So again, net in means that your immigration is larger than your emigration, and net out migration is when your emigration is larger than your immigration. I know it's, vocabulary term, bingo right there. But anyway, it's very simple to figure out, right? If you've got you've got 5 emigrants, you've got 4 immigrants, then obviously you have one more emigrant than immigrant, and that means you are net out. Please remember, countries that are net out are usually stage 2 countries. Countries that are net in are usually stage 4 for sure, and usually stage 3 as well. Alrighty? So anyways, number 18, know what push and pull factors are. Push factors are what causes you to leave a country. It's the negative that existed in your country that caused you to want to leave. A pull factor is what attracts you to the place that you ended up in. A pull factor is usually positive, right? Because it helps explain why you chose to migrate to where you migrated to. Push and pull factors, cultural push factors, well, cultural push factors could be things like, war, right? Because that's political, which is created by humans. Ethnic cleansing, where one ethnicity is being wiped out by another. Perhaps a civil war, a rebellion, or a revolution that occurs within a country. Potentially terrorism could be a reason why people leave. Religious persecution, where your religious group is being persecuted, and so you don't want to be thrown in jail or worse, and so you leave, you flee. Political, a lack of political rights, right, would be another push factor, or I should say a cultural factor. Yeah, so, all of these things can kind of come together technically when you really think about it. Like slavery is a cultural push factor as well. So again, anything that is really a result of human behavior and human activity that causes people to leave. All right? In the same sense, your pull factors culturally could be more political freedom or more religious freedom, right? It could be peace. It could be tolerance for others. Any of those things, right? If the push is what causes you to leave, the pull is what solves that problem, what causes you to no longer feel that pressure in the new country that you moved into. Economic push and pull factors, jobs or a lack of jobs, it would be the push. An abundance of job, a lot of jobs would be the pull. Maybe wages, lower wages might be a push, higher wages might be a pull. Benefits, right, like for your job, that could be, a lack of them would be a push, and more benefits would be a pull. Other economic reasons, depression, right, economic depression, or just economic decline, maybe a lack of development in a particular country. All of those could help explain why people would leave and potentially move to a new, better economic country. Environmental, oh gosh, push factors environmentally. It might be a flood, or it might be a drought. It might be you know, a lot of snow, or snowstorms, or hurricanes, or earthquakes. And obviously the pull in those situations would generally be a lack of those things, right? Protection from those things. So anyways, the cultural, economic, environmental, please remember political ones fall under cultural as well, right? Education would be a cultural push and pull factor. If there's a lack of it in one place, you move to a new place because of it, that would be the pull. Anyways, that's what push and pull factors are, and you should have a few examples of cultural, economic, and environmental in your back pocket that you can potentially use. Know the two major laws of why people migrate according to Ravenstein. Okay. People migrate most of the time for economic reasons. All right? So the number one reason why people migrate is for economic reasons. All right? That's probably the simplest one of his, and it's the one that's probably the most accurate still today. All righty? The other major law of why people migrate, well, to be honest with you, there really isn't one. That's the major law as to why people migrate. They migrate primarily for economic reasons, and that's what he indicated. Now, he does talk, I know we have a question about these later on as well. He does also talk about, if you recall, that people tend to migrate to large economic centers. He also did kind of reference chain migration, that people tend to follow others that have gone along the way ahead of them as well. So primarily his two major laws of why people migrate, well, primarily for economic reasons. Secondarily, chain migration is a factor as well. Know what a refugee is and how it's different from most migrants. Okay, so a refugee is somebody who is escaping persecution or war to the point where their safety is in jeopardy, all right? Where if we sent them back or we forced them to go back, their lives would be at risk. This usually means they're escaping persecution from their own government, or they're escaping some sort of conflict, a civil war, a revolution, or a rebellion, something that is causing a mass loss of life. So that's what a refugee is. The United Nations recognizes refugees, again, as people who are escaping persecution and or conflict where their safety is at risk and they are unable to return to their homeland. That means it's different than most migrants because they don't really have as much of a choice in the matter, right? And more importantly, they don't really have an option to go back home. Unlike most migrants who do technically have the ability to return back to their country of origin should it be needed. What are some significant refugee streams that have occurred over the last 25 years? My goodness, we have a few of those. Okay, so we're going to look at some refugee streams in class tomorrow morning before we do the FRQ, but this is an awesome map that I've added to the haiku page as well. And what it's showing you is major refugee streams or forced migration streams that have occurred since the 1990s. What they show here is the country, and in the circle is how many folks were refugees from that country. And then the line really just shows you how long it took. So the longer the line goes left to right, that's how long the refugee crisis took. So this one here, the first one went from about 1990 till about midway through 1992. Obviously the top to bottom of the line just is a visual reflection of how many people were affected by it. So let's start in Liberia. Liberia had a civil war in 1990. Lasted for about a year and a half. By the way, Liberia is an African country. Civil war, fought between two sides fighting for control of the government. It was not religious, it was just a political war. But because of this long-standing civil war, about 820,000 people were forced to flee. Myanmar, 600,000. A repressive government that repressed certain cultural minority groups. This has actually just started again, and so this is the older example of what happened in Myanmar when the Rohingya, which is a minority group, a minority religious group there, was forced out by the more dominant cultural group and the government. Armenia, Azerbaijan, again, we have some ethnic cleansing going on in these countries as Armenians tried to kick out Azerbaijanis and Azerbaijanis tried to kick out Armenians to both make their countries a little bit more ethnically pure. Probably the most famous example of ethnic cleansing in the 1990s happened in the small sub-Saharan African country of Rwanda. It was an ethnic tribal conflict between two groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis. They are the two dominant tribes or ethnicities in that country. What happened was the Hutus started to wipe out, to exterminate the Tutsis because the Hutus wanted Rwanda to just be made up of one tribe, one ethnicity. All right? Ultimately, almost 2.5 million people were forced to flee to nearby countries as a result of the crisis in Rwanda. Kosovo is in Europe. It's in southern Europe. Again, ethnic cleansing by Serbians from the nearby country of Serbia. They were trying to make Kosovo part of their country, and one of the ways to do that was to force Christians and Muslims out of that country, so only Serbian Orthodoxes were still there. Ultimately, 900,000 people were refugees from Kosovo in the late 1990s. All right, Afghanistan, from about 2000 to 2002, there was a U.S.-led war against the government of Afghanistan, which was known as the Taliban, because the Taliban was supporting terrorists like Osama bin Laden. So we invaded the country, we knocked out the Taliban government. It led to a massive terrorist insurgency where terrorists were fighting against us throughout the country. Ultimately, for about the next couple of years, 640,000 refugees from Afghanistan. Iraq as well. Remember, as a result of 9/11, we invaded both Afghanistan and Iraq. And as a result of these wars between the United States and our allies, fighting against terrorist groups in these places, millions of people were displaced, including 1.5 million from Iraq as a result of our invasion of that country. That refugee crisis actually continued between 2006 and 2008. This is when we essentially left the country, and terrorists kind of regained strength and tried to topple or overthrow much of the country. This is when ISIS developed. ISIS kind of tried to overrun the country and declare it its own kind of independent country under their Islamic rule. Ultimately, 2 million Iraqis were lost, I should say, as refugees during that crisis. Now, the greatest refugee crisis we have suffered since 1990 has occurred between 2012 and 2017. It's the Syrian refugee crisis. 5.5 million Syrian refugees, which is a massive number. The Syrian refugees, there's a civil war that's been raging in that country. Originally, there were rebellions where they overthrew a dictator named Assad. After he got knocked out, he's still technically there, the government kind of is fighting against a number of rebel groups. Some of those rebel groups actually fight against each other. The U.S. is now involved with airstrikes. Russia is involved with airstrikes. It is just a real conflict that continues to really just cost Syrian lives. And 5 million people over 5 years have basically fled the country as their towns have been overrun by one side or the other, and they're worried about being persecuted by the people that take over their region or their town. The most recent crisis is again in Myanmar. Again, the Rohingya, which is a minority religious and cultural group, is being expelled from the country, ethnic cleansing, as the government tries to eliminate them because they're viewed as not as loyal, not as faithful, and more troublesome to control. So those are some of the famous examples of mass refugee crises since 1990. It's always a good idea to have one or two of them in your back pocket. I think Rwanda, I think Syria, I think Myanmar are all really good examples that you should at least know a little bit about. All right? Let's keep this train rolling. And let's get back to the questions. By the way, you're going to be doing an activity in class tomorrow at the start of class where you're going to have an opportunity to learn a little more about these. I hope you take advantage of those because they will help you on the exam. 21, by the way, refugees leave your country. Remember, an IDP is an internally displaced person. That is an individual that has to flee their country against their will, or flee their home against their will, but they relocate to another location within the same country. Similar to a refugee, they just don't cross the boundaries, the borders, and go into another country. Number 21. Explain what intervening obstacles are to migration. An intervening obstacle, remember, is an obstacle that prevents a migrant or slows a migrant down from getting to their final destination. So usually intervening obstacles have been geographic throughout history. Oceans, rivers, lakes, mountains, deserts. These are all historic and famous examples of intervening obstacles. But please remember, intervening obstacles can also be cultural, right? Border patrol, walls, laws that prevent you from getting into a particular place. How about hostility to migrants? That would potentially be an intervening obstacle that would prevent you from going to a place or slowing you down, right? So those are cultural examples of intervening obstacles. What about, hey, a new language or a different religion? Those might be cultural barriers or reasons why migrants would be less likely to go to a particular place. An intervening opportunity is when a better opportunity comes along to a migrant while they are on their way to a potential destination and they choose to stay somewhere else. So, for instance, if Mr. Majewski is, let's say, rolling to, I don't know, Florida to take a new job, I leave California, I'm on my way, let's say I make it into Texas, I get a better job offer there. Well, that was an intervening opportunity that prevented me from getting to my final target, Florida, because I had a better opportunity or an opportunity I was willing to take that prevented me from getting to my ultimate spot that I wanted to. Intervening opportunities don't have to be economic, right? It could be something like a relationship, I suppose, as well. Ultimately, intervening opportunities are usually a good thing. I think intervening obstacles are generally not as good of a thing for a migrant. All right. Number 22, know what internal migration is, including both types. Okay, internal migration is migration within the same country. And there are two types. Inter-regional is when you move from one region to another. This has almost always historically been moving from a rural area to an urban one in order to seek better economic opportunity as a country industrializes/develops. Another type of internal migration is intra-regional. Intra-regional migration is when you move within the same region, so you stay in the same city, or you stay in the same urban area, or you stay in the same area of the country. You just make a move within it. This usually occurs not as much because of economic opportunity. It oftentimes occurs because of changes in lifestyle. Of course, usually the best example is a movement from an urban neighborhood to a suburban neighborhood to a suburb. This is oftentimes because of a better perceived quality of life, better services, more peace, more tranquility, less pollution. All of those factors, less parking issues, more space for yards, right? Maybe potentially better schools. All of these things come together to cause sometimes folks to stay within the same region, but to move intra-regionally. And of course, suburban growth is usually the most famous example of that. Number 23, what is international migration? That's movement from one country to another. And there are two major types. Voluntary, of course, is when you choose to move from one country to another. Again, almost always for economic purposes. Of course, forced migration is when it is against your will. Now, forced migration can technically be internal as well. For instance, the Trail of Tears. But most examples of forced migration are international. Of course, the African slave trade is a great example of that. Potentially folks that, like women or men that are caught up in the sex trafficking industry are oftentimes forced to migrate against their will. A lot of times refugees, right, are forced migrants who are being forced to leave their homelands. People who are caught up in environmental disasters are oftentimes forced migrants if they are unable to rebuild in the same spot. Number 24, be able to compare the stages of the migration transition to the demographic transition. What type of migration occurs in each stage and why? Well, folks, that means we're going to our handy-dandy chart here. Migration transition, Wilbur Zielinski came up with it. Remember, in stage 1, there's really not a lot of permanent migration, more just mobility and circulation as people are moving seasonally, looking for game, food sources. Remember, these are hunters and gatherers, not a lot of settled agriculture, and so most of the time you're hunting part of the year. You live in small groups, small nomadic bands that move around searching for food sources. That might be game, like animals, that might be nuts, that might be berries. It's going to vary, and you're going to move cyclically, seasonally. You're going to circulate around in a pattern according to the seasons or according to the days, looking for those food sources. We don't really see international migration at all in a stage 1 country. That begins in stage 2. Stage 2 is when we start to see international migration, and you start to see people fleeing or leaving stage 2 countries if they can, to head to more developed places, economic centers elsewhere, usually in MDCs that are in stage 3 or stage 4. You also see internal migration, specifically interregional migration, usually rural to urban. Again, this has a lot to do with the fact that there is less need for agricultural workers in a developing country than there were before. And so some of those farmers who lost their jobs and lost their farms are going to head into cities where oftentimes there's actually an abundance of jobs because of the developing industry that exists there. Stage 3 country is going to be more developed, right? It's starting to become more developed. And that means, one, you're going to see international migration here, but it's going to be more in-migration instead of out like it was in stage 2. That in-migration is because some of the folks from stage 2 countries see your country as a better possible source for them to settle and to work and to make a living. You'll also see internal migration in stage 3. Usually the interregional migration is slowing down by stage 3, and instead it gets replaced with intra-regional city-to-suburb movement as we start to see newer suburban homes developments pop up, and we start to see the middle and upper classes begin to relocate to those. They can still live in the city thanks to, automobiles and other transportation, and they can get the benefits of living in newer, larger, usually more spread out suburban neighborhoods within that area. Stage 4, you're going to really continue to see a lot of what you saw in stage 3. You're going to see even more net in-migration in stage 4. You're even more of a target, of a source for international migrants and guest workers in stage 4. You're also going to continue to see that intra-regional migration, that city-to-suburb stream that you noticed in stage 3. It gets even more pronounced in stage 4. I should also mention stage 4 is when you're probably going to start to see for the very first time a little bit of counter-urbanization, where some wealthy and or retired people have gotten to a point where they want to leave the city altogether for peace, for tranquility. They view it as a more desirable quality of life, and they're still able, obviously, to, thanks to the internet, technology, cell phones, and automobiles, they're able to still benefit from living in a rural life with the peace, quiet, but they can still function as if they were living in a more urbanized area. All right? Stage 5, generally speaking, is not usually considered a stage in the migration transition, but if it was, stage 5 would really just be stage 4, even more extreme numbers, even more examples of that intra-regional and international migration. All right? Anyways, that is Wilbur Zielinski's migration transition model that you had better know. All right, now we need to know Ravenstein's laws on the distance of migration. Okay, number 1, migrants usually travel shorter distances. All right, second law is when they do travel larger distances or they do travel internationally, they almost always end up in large economic centers, big cities, where there is a view that there are much more job availability that exists there. The 2 laws on the gender of migrants, most migrants are men. alrighty, and particularly they are young men, and most migrants generally do not have, are single. They don't have kids, or at least they do not travel with a family and kids. That kind of blends into the two laws on the family status of migrants as well. So, migrants travel short distances. That's what Ravenstein said. That's still pretty much true. All things considered, if you have two choices, you're going to go to the one, and they're the same, you're going to go to the one that's closer to you. When you do travel larger distances, you tend to settle in big cities where there is a belief that there is more economic opportunity for you. Migrants tend to follow their family members. So usually there is a flow of migrants to an area because there have been previous migrants that have gone there in past generations. Secondly, remember, he says, most migrants are male, and especially young males. This is much less true than it was in the past. This is one of his laws that just is not as accurate as it used to be. A majority are still men, but it's almost 50-50, and women are almost as likely to make the trip at this point as men are. And then the two laws on the family status of migrants. The general rule here is that migrants generally do not bring children. They tend to come as young individuals or couples, and then they have children in the target destination. This too is not as accurate as it once was, because we're seeing more children migrate in modern times than ever before. The second major law of migration is that the elderly generally do not do it. The older you are, the less likely you are to migrate, largely because maybe you're more settled in your original location, or maybe it's just physically more difficult for you to do so. Again, while most of Ravenstein's laws are pretty accurate still today, it is the ones that have to do with men versus women and family sizes that really are the least accurate compared to the past. Number 26, know which continents have net in and net out migration and why. Well, the net in continents, right? So the continents that are, or the regions that are net in, North America, the United States and Canada, big destinations. Oceania, right? Australia, New Zealand, big destinations. Other net in regions, Europe, especially Western and Northern Europe, huge net in regions as well. The Middle East is actually net in because they're attracting so many workers from other areas in order to help them rapidly build and meet the needs of those populations in that area. What are net out? Pretty much the rest of the world. Latin America is net out as they head into North America. Sub-Saharan Africa is net out as they move into North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Asia, for the most part, is net out, especially as they are moving towards Oceania, as they are moving towards North America, as they are moving towards the Middle East, or as they are moving from one Asian country to another. All of those are causing it to be a net out region. Anyways, why do MDCs have the highest rates of net immigration? Because they oftentimes offer the most jobs or the highest paying jobs. They oftentimes offer economic opportunity for people, like benefits that an LDC wouldn't. They might offer health care. They might offer education. And when I say these things, I mean they offer a superior or better version of those than you would otherwise receive in an LDC. The greatest migratory flows worldwide. Well, this is a map that I want you to focus on in order to answer that question. This shows you the major migratory flows that occur. Latin America and Mexico into North America, particularly the United States. And economic reasons are the primary factors for that. Also education, political freedom, right? Religious freedom in some instances as well. Other massive migration routes or flows, Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Depending on where you are in Sub-Saharan Africa, you'll head to Europe. Usually those in Western Africa and Central Africa move to Western Europe. Usually those in East Africa or underneath that will head into Eastern Europe. Now, please remember, these are normally voluntary migration routes, but in recent times, because of the crisis in Syria, because of some of the crises in Sudan, because of some of these other refugee crises, a lot of forced migrants have moved into North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe as well, fleeing or escaping persecution in their home countries. Finally, please note Asia, in particular India and Southeast Asia. Do you notice all of this movement moves towards the Middle East, and some of that continues on to Europe? We also have a separate flow that moves into Oceania from Southeast Asia and South Asia as well. Almost all of those, again, motivated by economics, but again, if you could know one or two examples, and by the way, when I say economics, these are stage 2 countries, stage 2 migrants that are generally moving into stage 3 and stage 4 places for all of the economic reasons and political reasons and health reasons that we have talked about in our classes. Anyways, let's go back to our big questions. All right. Explain each of the 3 waves of immigration patterns into the United States and which groups made up a majority of those immigrants. Alrighty. Well, let me go to my PowerPoint, and I want to go to this image, if I can ever get there. Here we go. Alright, folks, so this is the slide that I gave to you in class. Now, it's describing the largest waves of population growth, and this is actually kind of erroneous. It's really the first, second, and third U.S. waves. And what it is, remember, before 1800, it was all English, all right? English were the ones that came over. We were English colonies, right? Historically, that had been the case. Things start to change in the 1820s and 30s. And remember, we still have Europeans coming in the 1800s, but they're not really English anymore. Most of the Europeans that come beginning in the first half of the 1800s come from Ireland. They come from Germany. Remember Ireland, we had the potato famine and other environmental disasters. In Germany, we have political chaos and upheaval with a variety of civil wars and rebellions and revolutions. There was also a feeling that both places were overcrowded and overpopulated. There was an overuse of land in both places, so the soil is being depleted, so farming is not as good as it was previously. All of those factors caused Irish and German immigrants to flee their countries, and many of them found their way to the United States. Alrighty? Then remember, and by the way, what's attracting them to the United States? Well, we have a bunch of available jobs because we've started to industrialize. Secondly, we have a lot of available land for farmers who are interested in potentially starting over and farming in the United States. More importantly, we have a lot of cheap land. We have a lot of low-skilled jobs that you didn't have a lot of skill or education or training for in order to take in factories inside the United States. Second half of that era, we still get Europeans beginning in about 1890 or 1900, but the big difference is it's no longer Northern and Western Europeans, it's Southern and Eastern Europeans. So no longer do we have Irish and Germans as much. We start to have Italians and Poles and Greeks and Russians and Jews from various areas of Eastern and Southern Europe as well. These folks are coming as well for jobs, for economic opportunity. Now we are full-blown industrializing, and now we need massive numbers of low-skilled, low-wage workers, and these folks are willing to take the risk and come to the United States and to start over again. Now, there's a lot more backlash to these groups because they don't speak English. They don't speak, they're not Protestants, they're Catholics, and they're Orthodox Christians, and they're Jews. So that seemed to a lot of Americans like perhaps these folks were changing what it meant to be an American, and there was a lot of resistance to them. So, in the 1920s, remember, we passed the National Origins Act, which created quotas. I should also mention, hey, some of the other reasons why we see so much movement here out of those countries isn't just because of a lack of jobs or economic opportunity. There was also a lot of conflict during this period as well. We had a world war in the 1910s that displaced millions of people. We have communist revolutions in Russia, which displaced millions of people. And so a lot of Europeans flee not just for economic opportunity, but because of wars and communist rebellions that are occurring in those places at that time. Alrighty. Anyways, in the United States in the 1920s, remember, we enacted the National Origins Act. We enacted those quotas where we restricted the number of immigrants coming in, specifically from Southern and Western Europe, and we banned Asian immigration. We gave preference only to Northern and Western Europeans. Immigration went way down as a result, and that was also because of the Great Depression. World War II as well caused immigration to decrease. Then beginning in the 1960s, we start to see massive increases in immigration. That's because in 1965 we passed the Immigration Act of 65, which eliminated the quota system. It allowed basically immigrants to come from any region regardless of who they were. And almost immediately we had a massive rise in immigration to our highest levels ever. And we noticed that the immigration waves changed and now started to be Latin American and Asian immigrants who were no longer as restricted from getting into the country. So those are our three waves. Really we're seeing the third wave continue all the way up until today. Asian and Latin American immigration continue to be at all-time highs. All right. Which country and continents currently have the highest immigration levels into the United States? Well, Latin America and Asia do. Latin America, specifically Mexico, is responsible for probably as much as 60% of all of our immigration. Other countries in Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, are all considered areas that have significant number of Latin American migrants. In Asia, it's the Philippines that usually has the largest number of immigrants to the United States. Makes sense, they used to be a U.S. territory. Vietnam has a massive stream of immigrants to the country. And of course, China, China and India, although generally those two countries, not as many immigrants as the Philippines and Vietnam historically. When it comes to the Caribbean, usually Cuba and the Dominican Republic and Haiti are the countries that have the highest immigration to the United States. Not Puerto Rico. Remember, Puerto Rico is a territory of ours. Their people have citizenship, and so therefore they do not need to immigrate. They're able to come to the U.S. legally anytime that they want to. Which countries and continents what are undocumented immigrants and how many of them currently reside in the U.S.? An undocumented immigrant is an immigrant who is here despite having the legal status to be here. We call them undocumented because they technically do not have official authorized legal paperwork or legal documents that indicate that they are supposed to be here. We believe there's about 11 to 12 million. It might be more. It's hard to effectively guess, to effectively determine it, I should say. Percentage of the workforce, about 5.5% to 6%. Which states do most of them reside? California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, New York. Notice those are states that are right on the borders or have large, massive cities that will attract more migrants to them. What are the regions for undocumented immigration? I'm not even totally sure what I mean by that question. Undocumented immigration regions, well, the West and the South. So the Southwest is a region for undocumented immigration, particularly from Mexico and Latin America. The West Coast, it has our largest numbers of Asian undocumented immigration, and obviously Florida and New York, the East Coast, generally have our largest numbers of Caribbean and European undocumented immigrants. It's all a matter of proximity. It's all a matter of distance decay and how close you are to your country of origin. All right? Anyways, that's undocumented immigration. Remember, the U.S. Mexico is the #1 source of legal immigrants and undocumented immigrants to the country. Number 30, what is chain migration? How does it affect immigration into the country? Okay, chain migration is when migrants follow previous family members or close friends who moved to a location before them. It leads to ethnic clustering. It leads to ethnic neighborhoods or states, or cities, I should say, or even entire counties or states where one immigrant population is clustered. So it leads to places like, Little Saigon. It leads to Chinatowns. It leads to the clustering of immigrants who are hoping that since they're making this move, if they live amongst people that they're familiar with, right, that maybe speak the same language or practice the same religion, can help them to potentially get jobs in the community, that their transition will be smoother and easier to make. All right? So chain migration tends to cause migrants to settle in particular areas of the country where other similar migrants have already located. That's, again, why Southern California has such massive numbers of Asian and Hispanic Latino immigrants, partly because of chain migrants that have come before them. By the way, let's go to the next question. Explain the two major policies that host nations use to accept immigrants. Okay. So they can use one of two things. They can use guest worker programs. Guest worker programs are where you give people temporary visas to work or study in your country, but they're only permitted to be here a certain amount of time before they are asked to leave. And they know ahead of time how much that is supposed to be. Your other example would be official legal residents. Legal residents I guess what I'm looking for here is guest workers. Guest workers are usually used in Europe and in the Middle East. They're very similar to our temporary residents. They're there to work as well on a set contract. They're sometimes called time contract workers, where they are there for a set amount of time and then they too are expected to leave. So you can either do the guest worker plan, also known as time contract worker, or you could give legal residency to folks, which allows them to stay in your country permanently if they want to, without a set time limit as well. All right. The U.S. does both. We offer guest workers to students and to workers, and at the same time, we offer permanent residency to some Americans as well. All right. Remember, the U.S. does give priority to some groups within this country. We give priorities, remember, to people with special skills, with people that want to spend a lot of money here, or to people that are family members of legal immigrants that are already here. Number 31. We're going to continue with 31. What are national and hemispheric quotas, and what preferences does the United States give to some immigrants? Remember, national quotas were where we limited the number of people that could come from any one country. That was viewed as kind of racist and discriminatory. Hemispheric quotas are what we have now. It's where we basically say we're not going to limit migration from any one country, but we're only going to let 1/4 of our people in from each of the 4 hemispheres of the world. All right? It's viewed as more open and democratic and tolerant because now we're not going to limit people from specific countries just because Americans might be fearful, I guess you could say, of them. What preferences do we give to immigrants? I think I already mentioned that, so I'm going to jump over to 32. 32, explain what brain drain is. Brain drain is when the best and the brightest, the most educated, the most talented, the ones that could probably help an LDC to develop the most, they relocate to MDCs because of higher wages, higher job opportunities or economic opportunities, better benefits, and they leave behind their home country. This is bad for the home country. It's great for MDCs like the United States because we tend to pull the very best and the very brightest from around the world into our country. But of course, we're kind of at the same time, this is causing us to weaken maybe the development or the growth in those other places. Our policies, particularly where we give special status to those with skills we need, have absolutely contributed to brain drain around the world. 33. What are U.S. and European attitudes towards immigration into their countries? Okay. Well, generally Americans want there to be, and Europeans want there to be stricter guidelines. They want the borders better protected. At the same time, they want paths towards residency and citizenship for most undocumented immigrants that are already here. And both the U.S. and Europe have a reputation for wanting immigrants to assimilate, to blend into culture as quickly as possible. There has been much more resistance to immigration, particularly refugees, in the U.S. and Europe over the last 3 to 4 years. This has a lot to do with changing politics in both places. And as more refugees have arrived in Europe from Syria, there's been more negative reaction from some countries who worry that they are accepting whose people worry that they are accepting too many foreign citizens into their country. Unfortunately, since the Middle East, which has been a source for a lot of migrants, has been associated over the last 25, 30 years with terrorism, then unfortunately a lot of these migrants coming from these places are oftentimes scrutinized and or scapegoated for their relationship with their home country. Number 34, describe the 5 main different types of interregional migration that have occurred in the U.S. Remember, originally Americans hugged the coastline, if you recall, which meant that we lived along the Atlantic coast. We generally, where is my hugging the coastline? Let me find that bad boy. I swear it's here. Hugging the coastline, where did you go? There we go. It was right at the top the entire time. So remember, we hugged the coast, the East Coast originally. Those were our original migrants, our original settlers. Those are people like the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They were seeking out religious and economic freedom. They traded still a lot with England, France, and the rest of Europe, so they stayed along the coastline. They built farms in small towns. Eventually, as more folks started to arrive, they crossed the Appalachian Mountains, our first major mountain chain. And we begin to settle what we call the Midwestern states today, all the way up to the Mississippi River. Then, remember, we jump over all the way to the West Coast after that, between 1850 and 1890, about the next 40 or 50 years. We're looking for gold and other precious metals. We're looking to strike it rich, and so Americans flood to the West Coast. Then, beginning in about 1900, we start to fill in those Great Plains a little bit better. We go back and we fill in some of those areas that we had jumped over when we were rushing to the gold previously. Since 1950 to 2010, what type of interregional migration have we seen? Well, we've seen a movement towards the south, towards the Sun Belt. As populations have decreased in the Rust Belt areas, they have increased in the Sun Belt, all at the same time. Next question. Oops. Next question is number 35. That's the last question, actually. Describe recent trends in migration into the U.S. from rural to urban areas. Well, remember, really since about the 1900s, we've seen massive movement of people from rural areas to urban ones. That's continued all the way up until today. Remember, 5%. We were 5% urban in 1800. We were like 50% in 1920. Now we're probably 80 to 90% today. So we're seeing a continuation of movement of people from rural to urban areas for not just economic opportunity, but, you know, better access to technology, better access to services and goods that are offered in large urban areas. We've also seen urban to suburban movement. Remember, that is intra-regional movement, as we've seen folks relocating to mostly suburbs around cities in the United States. All right? And then explain what counter-urbanization is. Counter-urbanization, remember, is when we see folks that are moving voluntarily back out to rural areas. Usually these are like retirees, or these are people that want to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, and they can still afford to live a comfortable lifestyle while being removed from the city. Maybe that means they can work from home, or they're retired and they don't have to rely on getting to work every single day. Anyways, that's what I got for you on migration. Hopefully this helps. If not, if you have any questions, I do hope you will let me know. Mr. M signing off.